I think we're going to be sharing some interesting things with you again this evening. Intertestamental period. Okay, we will. We're through with the extent of Roman control. You might want to look on your outline. I'm going to kind of be following some of this. It's rare whenever I follow one of my outlines. So you might better want to mark this down somewhere that we're going to follow a little bit of this outline. Tonight we're going to be looking at what I've entitled the social strata of the Roman Empire. And as you see there on your outline, with particular emphasis on Palestine, the Jewish class structure. So we're going to look at, first of all, social strata, the twofold division in the Roman Empire, and then with particular reference to Jewish class structure, the poor free man, the rich aristocratic, and then two people under that, the money changer, the tax collector. Now I hope to get through with that would be 3A, 2B, 2A. Now did you follow that? Did you know what line we're on there? 3A, 2B, 2A. In other words, money changer. I hope we get down to the money changer and get through with that. The tax collector will tie us back into the last teachings about direct and indirect Roman taxes, and I don't think we'll get that far this evening. So that's what we're going to be on. You might want to hold that with you as we go along. I'll show you where we are as we go along. The social strata of the Roman Empire. Social backgrounds of the intertestamental period. The social strata of the Roman Empire. There were basically two classes. Yeah, the upper class and the lower class. And then both of these were made up of an A and a B. This is something that we have to know to begin with, because contrary to what is obviously so prevalent in American society, we have three classes: the upper class, the middle class, the lower class. And that's something that's relatively new, a relatively new invention in the cultures and societies and peoples and nations of the world, and we'll explain something about the origin of that later, although it's not important for intertestamental period. The upper class was composed of the aristocratic elite, the aristocratic elite. Or you could refer to them as the senatorial elite. They were aristocrats, they were descendants from Roman senators, most of them were. The upper class, the aristocratic or the senatorial elite. These were aristocratic landowners. You had to be a landowner to be in this category. This was the highest of Roman society. Aristocratic landowners who were descended from Roman senators. And that needs to be kept in mind to distinguish that between other parts of the two classes, the upper and the lower class. And then the second division of the upper class was known as the equestrian order. They were really not middle class. Sometimes you might read that, or that might be said. They really were not middle class. No such thing as middle class existed anywhere in the world until relatively recent times. The equestrian order. Now, what have we already seen? Where does that come back into play in studies in the past or in intertestamental period? The equestrian order. The prefects, the procurators, the vast majority of them were equestrians. They were from the equestrian order. And then we have the lower class, composed of free men, not freed men, that would be a different term, and slaves. So we have the upper class composed of the senatorial or the aristocratic elite. Aristocratic, filthy, rich landowners, generally descended from Roman senators, the equestrians, that made up many parts of Roman government, such as we've seen with the prefects and the procurators. The lower class made up of free men and slaves. Now Felix, the prefect, was a freed man. He was a former slave who became free. So he was not from the equestrian order, and he was the one exception, I think, that we looked at, the one exception for the procurators or the prefects being from the equestrian order. which you could say is the second order of the upper class. You've got the senatorial or the aristocratic elite and the equestrians, and then in the lower class, there's no middle class. In the lower class, you have the slaves and the free men. Now, the slaves vastly outnumbered the free men, as well as the equestrians, as well as the aristocratic. So if we want to know numbers, it'd be minus and plus. The lower class obviously made up the vast majority of the Roman Empire. Free men and slaves, very few senatorial, elite, aristocratic members of Roman society, and not that many in the equestrian order. As a matter of fact, the slaves may have constituted as much as 1/2 of the population of the entire Roman Empire in the 1st century A.D. The slaves may have occupied as much as 1/2 of the whole Roman Empire. The 1st century A.D. Now there was no such thing as the middle class, no middle class as such. That doesn't come until the French Revolution, and it's most popular in the United States today. The United States is probably the country that best represents a threefold division socially of the strata of society between the upper, and you even hear what class you're in: lower class, middle class, upper class. And then you have each of those classes divide up into lower, middle, upper. Your middle, lower, middle, upper, middle, or you can go up to upper, you can go to lower and divide it up in the same three ways. You remember the French Revolution had brought about the aristocrats, the bourgeoisie from Karl Marx, Des Capital, and Communist Manifesto fame, as well as the proletariats, which gave us our three divisions of society then, and it's carried over in many modern countries today, those that are industrialized and those that are civilized. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't such things as middle men. There were middle men, but many times the middle man, all the time, he'd have to be either upper or lower for himself. Depends on who he's closest to. He could be a supplier. He could be something in between goods needed and goods had, but it didn't make him, just because he's a middle man, part of the middle class. So that needs to be kept in mind, because when we come to the New Testament, we basically either have someone who is upper class or someone who is lower class. If you're lower class, you can be a slave, you can be a freeman. If you're upper class, you're going to be something of this order. Now, when you get into Palestine, we don't have the senatorial elite because they're Jewish people, not descended from Roman senators. They have not come from horsemanship in the past, so they're not of the equestrian order. So we name it something different, such as the Sanhedrin and the high priesthood and the priest in Israel were those who constituted the upper class. But we'll be to that here in a moment anyway. If you turn over to Matthew chapter 24, from what we've said thus far, it should be obvious to you that slavery must have constituted a major problem in the 1st century A.D. If our figures are correct in assuming that as many as half of the people of the Roman Empire, that's millions of people, not thousands, millions of people, were in slavery. It's quite a problem in the world of this time. The treatment of the slaves varied from good to bad. That all was dependent upon the master of the slave. You could be a doctor, a lawyer, a philosopher, and still be a slave. Just because, and see, that's totally reversed from what we would think today, because it's dependent upon birth. You're either born into the aristocratic family, or you're born from a slavery couple, your mother and father, and therefore you're born into servitude yourself. Now, you can better yourself in schooling and training and become a lawyer, become a philosopher, become a doctor, but you'll always be a slave, though. And what's interesting, many of the senatorial elite would have as their tutors slaves, and their slaves were better educated than they were themselves. And that's why some of these slaves ended up as philosophers and lawyers and doctors and bankers and things of that order, but they still remained a slave, still bound to someone else. And many times they would take the slave and they would become the pupil of their own slave, because the slave many times was better educated than they were. Now that all depends, again, on the master and where you were and what your circumstances were. So it was all determined by birth. So Just because we have a doctor or a lawyer or a philosopher or a banker or financier or something on that order doesn't mean that we're talking about someone in the upper class. Many times, a surprisingly large number of times, we have reference not to a free man but to a slave, someone on the bottom rung of the ladder. We know in the New Testament that both Jesus and the apostles had to face the question, the issue of slavery, and they face it more or less passing over it. It's assumed to be the present state of many people. Jesus' parables, Jesus' teachings are spiced with many examples of slavery. And it's not like we have teaching on slavery as such, or teaching, pro or con about it. It's just that it's assumed to exist in the Roman Empire, and Palestine happens to be a part of that empire. In Matthew 24, verses 42 to 51, there are just so many examples. I picked this chapter because we'll have two chapters together, 24 and 25, where in both chapters, Jesus will speak of slavery. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. And so he's going to build parables and teachings on just the common concept that was current in Roman Palestine of that day. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Who then is a faithful and wise slave? Now, there were not that many servants in this day, and most of the places, not all of them, but the vast majority of the KJV places that rendered doulos as servant just gave us a false translation, because a servant could be something like a maid that you have. But a slave is something else. A slave is bound to you. A slave is chattel property. A slave is nothing. You own the person. A servant, you hire them for the services that they give to you. Now, it's still rather lowly, but I trust you can see just from what I've said thus far that still the position of a servant would be much higher than that of a slave. A servant could go and come as he wants. If he doesn't like the work there, well, he'll quit and go find another job, go serve someone else. A slave, well, you can't quit. There's a big problem in the first century of runaways. That's what the little book of Philemon is all about, runaways, and Onesimus. And Philemon, his runaway slave, Onesimus, and Paul ending up converting him over in the city of Rome and sends him back. So who then is a faithful and wise slave, whom his Lord or his master hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Now here's a slave who has worked his way up by being what? Well, both faithful and wise. Blessed is that slave, whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. Now you probably won't see anything unique in this because you're so accustomed to the Bible. But he took a case that was current in history, in the culture in which he was at that time. We might put something like ditch digger in here or something, because we know that's a lowly type job, digging ditches. And so that would stand out to you, and you think, well, I'm accustomed to seeing servant or slave in the Bible. Well, don't, just because you're accustomed to it, lose the sense of the reference here that he's talking about slavery in the Roman Empire. And it's just assumed to exist, and so he's building a parable upon that. But if that evil slave shall say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming, when you're expecting your master to come home from his journey or whatever that day, and you're supposed to have everything ready, and shall begin to smite his fellow slaves, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that slave shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then in chapter 25, verse 14, for the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own slaves and delivered unto them his goods. They were property that you owned, but you put them, depending on how faithful and wise, how worthy they were, over various aspects of your inheritance and of your property. Unto one he gave 5, 2, 1, to every man according to his several ability. Or we could say in verse 45 of the preceding chapter, depending on how faithful and wise his servant was. One received 5, another 2, and another 1. And straightway took his journey. And so forth. I don't think I have to go into the parable itself. But we know it's talking about slaves. You see him in verse 19. After a long time, the Lord of those slaves cometh and reckoneth with them. In verse 21 and 23, and then finally down in verse 26, thou wicked and slothful slave. You should have done differently than what you did. So many of Jesus' parables just have references. You could turn almost anywhere in the Gospels and just find references. I'm over in Luke 12. We've got another parable in Luke 12, verses 41 through 48, dealing with the subject of slavery again. It was something easy to base parables upon because there were so many slaves in so many different parts of the empire. We see the subject of slavery in Paul's epistles. Romans 1 and verse 1. You see, slavery has been out of the United States, formally, legally, for over 100 years now. Now. That continued right up into the 1940s, and I guess you can find it in cattle ranches out west somewhere even to this day. But slavery as such passed away in this country with the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln. That's been 100 years ago. So if you weren't familiar with the Bible, you probably wouldn't be using terminology like this. You know, if you ever, when you're praying to God, call yourself his slave, because you think, slave? We don't have anything to do with slavery in this country. If you ever use that term, it's because you've gotten that term from the Bible. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, not a servant, but it can go and come as he wills, that can ask for a raise, that can express his opinions to his boss, his employer, of the disdain he has for certain forms of work that are required of him. A slave doesn't get to voice anything like that. A slave is chattel property. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, called an apostle and separated under the gospel of God. Then you see some teaching on it. Let's look at several places. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 20 through 24. The slavery question is an ethics question. We'll be looking at many of these passages. So this should kind of give you an introduction to the background of the social strata of the Roman Empire, to know why the apostles and Jesus, well, I was going to say deal with slavery the way that they do, or I almost should say the way they don't deal with the subject and the issue of slavery. It almost could be said that way if you know what I mean. Verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a slave? There were millions of them, which must have responded to the gospel in the 1st century A.D., who were called in the state of slavery. And so that was a big question. You know, what do I do now? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free and become a freed man, as Felix was, not a free man, a freed man. A freed man means once you were not free, and a free man just means that you've always been free. Use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a slave, is the Lord's free man. Made free, notice in the margin. A freed man would be a better word. Likewise also, he that is called, being free, is Christ's slave. You're bought with a price, be not ye the slaves of men. Well, you see, that verse almost seems to contradict verse 21. But that's for teaching in itself. And then over in Ephesians, you find it in Ephesians and Colossians as well. Slavery was a very large problem in the ancient world. Not just in the Roman world now, I don't mean that by any means. It had existed from time immemorial up until this time. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5. He's dealt with wives, husbands, children, and parents. And now his new topic, slaves. Now for us today, we would say employees, because an employee is not a slave. But a slave is a type of employee. Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh. Now Paul adds that in there to make sure we know that we really only have one master, but this is master according to the flesh. With fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Now there's where Paul gets into his ethical teaching on slavery. That, of course, most definitely is applicable for today. Employees, be obedient to your employers according to the flesh with fear and trembling. How many of us really do that if we are employed by someone else? In singleness of your heart as unto Christ. Not with eye service, just when they're watching as men pleasers, but as the slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free, whether he's a slave or whether he is a free man. And then if you jump over into Colossians chapter 3 and verse 11, you know this phrase. We just read it there. This phrase is popular and recurring in Paul's epistles. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, he goes through this list, neither this nor that. You notice the last thing he ends with, neither bond nor free. Neither bond nor free. And then later in that chapter in verse 22, slaves obey, and he's just repeating what he said over in the book of Ephesians. And then we have one whole book of the Bible, and the whole book deals with the subject of slavery, and that's Philemon. That was the impetus for the book, the occasions that take place in the book with Philemon, with his evidently runaway slave Onesimus, and with Paul, who refers to himself here as Paul the Aged and a prisoner of Jesus Christ, with the various things that happen with these three men, and we've got 25 verses on it. And so you see the subject of slavery in verse 16. Not now as a slave, but above a slave. That's because evidently Onesimus has become converted. A brother beloved, especially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord. He's still your employee, but now he's your Christian employee. So the relationship that you have, although it's still master and slave, you have one that's higher than that, and that's brother and brother. So there's an introduction. That's all we're really going to say of the Roman Empire in general. The social strata was divided into two very distinct divisions. The upper class, where the money was, the equestrians, and the senatorial aristocratic elite landowners, and the lower class with the slaves and with the free men. Okay, next thing on the outline says Jewish class structure. Jewish class structure. And again, you'll see an upper class and a lower class. We start with the lower class there, the poor free man. Then secondly, the upper class, the rich aristocratic. Okay, most of the Jews, 90% of the Jewish people of the time of the Gospels and the book of Acts and the epistles, most of the Jews were of the lower class. You have to be one of these classes in the Roman Empire. The vast majority of them were in the lower class, but in the lower class, the vast majority of them were free men. They were not slaves. By the way, most of our teaching, you see, on slavery is in Paul's epistles, and these are written to Gentile churches outside of Palestine. Jesus uses the subject of slavery many times. That's only because everyone would be familiar with it. Not that he would have a lot of Jewish slaves around him, because most of the Jews were free men and not slaves. However, being a free man generally made you very, very poor. If you were a slave, at least you had the guarantee of a roof over your head and food because your master would provide that for you. If you're a free man, you're on your own then. And the vast majority of the Jewish people who were lower class, who were free men, were also very poor. There were only very, very few individuals who actually made it up into the upper class, the rich aristocratic. Now, they didn't make it there by being descended from Roman senators. They didn't make it there that way at all. Let's look at the ways how a Jewish man could end up out of the merry-go-round of the Jewish society, and that is of being a poor, lower-class free man, and end up on one of the upper rungs of the ladder. The American dream of rags to riches, that was not nearly as possible in most of the countries and peoples of antiquity, not nearly as possible as it is today, because you just don't have the wherewithal, you don't have the structured society of the lower, middle, and upper class as you have today, where you can work your way up. For the people of those days, for the most part, it was determined by birth. There were other ways to work your way up, but for the most part, if your parents were poor, you were poor. If your parents were rich, you were rich. But there were some exceptions. So let's look at some of the ways that the Jewish people, Jewish men in particular, could work their way up. So we're going to be down here to number 2 now on the outline, the rich aristocratic. Now remember what I've said, though, that most of the Jewish people were poor free men. You just have to keep these things in your mind as you read the New Testament, that most of the Jewish people were poor free men. But there were some exceptions. There really were only 2 ways you could end up in the upper class. First of all, by birth, being born into the right family. Now, the right family for the Romans was a senatorial family. The right family for a Jew was a religious family. To be born as the son of the high priest, to be born as the son of an important rabbi, to be born as the son of an important Pharisee, scribe, Sadducee, to be born into the family of an important religious leader in Israel, generally brought the person into good social and financial standing. Now you see, that's why we have one of our big problems in the Gospels between Jesus and the religious leaders. Most of the religious leaders were well-to-do financially, and most of the people they lorded over, were the shepherds of, were poor people. And of course the people really couldn't do anything about it, and the religious leaders kept them in that position, and it obviously produced many bad circumstances, and that's what Jesus is dealing with many times. So we have, first of all, you could end up in the rich aristocratic group by birth. And then secondly, you could end up, if you had not gone this way by birth, you could end up that way through a certain type of money occupation. Now the first of these that we're going to mention, that we're going to discuss this evening, the money changer, generally just happened to coincide with the same thing as being born into the right family, because the money-changing occupation was controlled by the religious leaders. So let me just say that to begin with. However, there were some exceptions where you could become a pupil. You could work under one of the important religious leaders, even though you yourself had not been born into the right, quote, end of quote, family. And because you had ties with him, you could end up in the position of one of the animal sellers or money changers. I just call them money changers because that's what they're called in the New Testament, and that would sum up not only the money changers but the animal sellers as well. So in other words, what I'm saying is you could almost be like a poor boy or something and end up in an aristocratic setting because of your ties to a local rabbi or Sadducee or Pharisee, and he was able to get you employed as an animal seller as you grew older, of course, your 20s or whatever, as an animal seller or a money changer. And that would bring you, regardless of your state of birth, That would be a way. That's why I'm separating this from birth. Although, as I'm saying, the vast majority of the animal sellers and the money changers were a part of the bureaucracy of religion in Israel. But there were exceptions to this. So let's begin looking at the money changer. We will look at the subject of the tax collector. The tax collector was in something quite different than the money changer, and particularly in the area of the tax collector, could we end up with someone, regardless of their birth, regardless of their ties to institutional religion in Israel, they could still end up from lower class into upper class. That's not quite as true with money changer, but we're going to put it in this order and look at that. So, that should have everything explained on the outline before I get into this. The social strata, twofold division, upper and lower class, and there are two parts of that, but we didn't list it here. Then B, we're just concerned with Jewish class structure. And there was an upper and lower in Jewish class structure. The poor free man, there were a few slaves, but the poor free man generally constituted the lower class. Rich, aristocratic, and he could end up there by one of two ways, by birth or by money occupation.
For the continu-
And he could end up there by one of two ways, by birth or by money occupation. See, I don't have all of this on the outline, or we would just go forever in pages. And then there are two different types of money occupation we have there, money changer and tax collector. Now, the Jewish law had established in the Old Testament, and was carried right up into New Testament times, that a half shekel temple tax, according to Exodus 30, had to be paid annually by men over the age of 20 to 50, I believe. And this is where the subject of the money changer comes in. Now, do you remember what we said about the temple tax based on Exodus 30? It was a ransom for the soul. It was for the maintenance and upkeep of the tabernacle, of the temple, of the sanctuary, depending on what dispensation we're under, whether it's tabernacle or temple. It was to be a half shekel for every Jewish male between the ages of 20 and 50 that was to be paid annually. Now, it can be paid at the temple any time during the year. Let's put ourselves into the Gospels. So we have a temple, not a tabernacle. We have the so-called Herodian temple. Herod began work on the temple in 19 B.C., remember. So we have an expanded temple, Herod's great temple. He's expanded Zerubbabel's old temple that was small in comparison to Solomon's. And the Jewish man could come any time during the year and pay his temple tax at the temple. However, for most people it was not convenient to come at any time during the year, because only a very, very small portion of the world's Jewish population actually lived in A, Jerusalem, B, Palestine, that is, within an easy reach of the city of Jerusalem. Now let me say that again, because that's something that you need to know. Only a very small percentage of the world's Jewish population actually lived in A, Jerusalem. And I don't mean 100, I mean thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews lived there. But there are many more Jews outside of Jerusalem than inside. A, Jerusalem, or B, in Palestine proper, which would put them within, let's say a maximum of 5 days trip from their home to the city of Jerusalem. Now, why is this true? Why is it that we have so few Jews? And again, few is a relative term here. There are many Jews in Palestine, hundreds of thousands of them, but relatively speaking, why is it that we have so few Jews in Jerusalem and so few Jews in Palestine in comparison with the extent of the whole Roman Empire? Because of Babylonian captivity. Because of what's referred to technically as the diaspora, because of the dispersion of the Jews into the various countries of the world. And there are references in places like James chapter 1 and verse 1. James chapter 1 and verse 1. James, and by the way, we're back to slave here. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, and also the half-brother of Jesus Christ. and the full brother of Jude, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. And there we get our term diaspora, the dispersion. To the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Which are scattered abroad. That means abroad from Palestine. We speak of being at home and abroad. At home is your local country. Palestine. Abroad means outside of Palestine. There's a cryptic reference in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. The introduction to both of these epistles, both James and 1 Peter. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered, the diaspora again. Now, I'm not saying that Peter's writing to Jews here. I'm just saying there's an interesting reference in both of these epistles. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered. And he's using the technical idea of the diaspora. And let's see, there's one other place where that appears, and I believe it's in John 7. There's 3 places in the New Testament where that appears. I don't have the other one down. I don't have any of them down. I just remember, I think, where they are. John 7:35. John 7:35. Well, we need to start with verse 32 to get the context of what he's saying here. Pharisees heard that the people murmured such things concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priest. Now read this in the context of what we're learning tonight. See, every one of these studies builds upon another study, and then you have to have these building blocks to understand things. The Pharisees and the chief priests, the upper class in Israel then. See, all the other people were lower class. Most of them were poor free men. You take someone, and if you're thinking of, and there are exceptions, by the way, of being a poor free man. You take someone like James and John. Why I'm backing down on that is because you may have a problem with the proposed connection that the family of Zebedee has to the high priesthood in Jerusalem. So let's put them out. Let's say Peter. Peter, evidently, although he's part of the lower class, he's a free man. He's not a slave. He's not equestrian. He's not senatorial elite. That only leaves him this one of the 4 things. He is a free man. He's not necessarily that poor. They had a very lucrative fishing business on the Sea of Galilee, as did some of the other disciples, apostles as well. But I was going to say something about the sons of Zebedee, the family of Zebedee. They appeared to be very well off. They had hired hands that went with them on their boat. That meant that the father had the business, and his 2 sons, James and John, worked with him, and they hired other people to go with them and help do some of the work. Well, like other poor free men among the Jews, and they could go along with them. They might be servants, but not slaves. And you find servants in the New Testament who are not slaves, and it could be a poor Jewish free man. Not a slave, but a poor Jewish free man who was a servant at the same time. Well, you know, the more people you employ, that means supposed to mean the better off you are. So perhaps we have a semi-well-off family in the family of Zebedee with James and John. But anyway, what brought that to my mind is seeing Pharisees and the chief priests. Definitely, this is the upper class, especially chief priests, above Pharisees, chief priests. Sent officers to take him. Then said Jesus unto them, Yet a little while I'm with you, and then I go unto him that sent me, and you'll seek me and not find me, and where I am you can't come. Then said the Jews among themselves, this is kind of confusing. Whither will he go that we shall not find him? And look at this. Will he go unto the dispersed? And there's that technical term again. Will he go unto the dispersed? They're speaking of the dispersion from the Babylonian Empire. Will he go unto the dispersed among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles? What manner of saying? Because the Jews would be living there with the Gentiles. Is this that he said, Ye shall seek me and shall not find me, and where I am, thither ye cannot come. So that was the reason we're looking at all of those passages, is to explain why we have so few Jews, relatively speaking, living in, first of all, Jerusalem and in Palestine in general. And what got us onto that was the payment of the temple tax. So many people, so many Jewish people who were Orthodox, who were devout, who were in some regards, followers of the Mosaic law and the teachings of the prophets. So many of them live so far away from the temple at Jerusalem. And yet to be a Jew, to be a good Jew, you could be a Jew in name only. To be a good Jew, you had to pay a male between 20 and 50 your annual temple tax. And you couldn't send it in the mail. You couldn't charge it on your credit card. You had to take the money there. Now, I mean, this is a big problem. You want to talk about people who are devoted to their religion. You have to take an annual holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem, even if you live in Spain, even if you live in Rome, even if you live in Babylon, Egypt. You have to get there once a year, at least once a year, to get your temple tax there. So it could be paid at any time during the year, but the most convenient time for most people was one of the great annual festivals, the three great annual festivals: Passover, Tabernacle, and Pentecost. For the Paschal Lamb and for the ingathering and for the booths, to give you three other names of them. But Passover and Pentecost and Tabernacles. Now, according to Mosaic law, those were the three annual feasts that necessitated the return of all Jewish men to the city of Jerusalem. That's 3 times a year, and you could pick one of those 3 times to pay your annual temple tax of a half shekel. Now, we probably all knew that, but, you know, when you hear someone teach on it and say it, then it really registers on you, wow, they had to return to Jerusalem annually 3 times a year to be a devout Jew. And you could just say, well, the law of Moses doesn't apply anymore. And maybe it wouldn't for you, since it's past Old Testament times, we're up into New. But for those that really wanted to do what they thought to be the law of Moses, then you either do it or you don't do it. And that's quite a journey. And think if you live in Spain or in Rome, and it takes you a month to get home. There are 3 months out of the year you've got to get back there to get to these annual feasts. And yes, there most certainly were people. There were multitudes of people who made the annual returns, particularly on Passover. If you didn't get anything else, if you couldn't get Tabernacles and Pentecost, you got Passover. But what about Acts 2? That's Pentecost there. And there were men, Jews, devout men from under every nation under heaven. From every nation under heaven, Acts chapter 2. And what were they there for? Well, they're there for the feast, and if they haven't paid their temple tax, that's what some of them were doing, and the rest of them were talking in tongues, and these were paying their temple tax that morning. Well, that's what you had to do whenever you went back. Now, something else that the rabbis taught. Isn't all of this interesting to think about, the Jewish people? Something else. The rabbis also taught that you could turn your offerings into money. Coins had been invented by this time. We have coinage now in the Roman Empire. That you could turn your offerings into money. I don't know how far we're going to get in this evening, but let's just do a little study back here in the Old Testament. Exodus 23, beginning with verse 14. Let me give you this reference, and then I'll give you a couple of other references here that I'm just thinking of right now. Exodus chapter 23, verse 14. Three times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Okay, you know that unleavened bread was just the feast that followed Passover. Passover was really a one-day feast, and unleavened bread was a 7-day feast. So they don't call it Passover here, but the two go together. Verse 16, in the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labors, which thou hast sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering. And so you get tabernacles and Pentecost, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy laborers out of the field. 3 times in a year all thy males shall appear before the Lord God. Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat, and so forth. I don't think we'll find it in this passage, but jump over to Leviticus. Leviticus chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, where we have the burnt, the meal, the peace, the sin, and the trespass offerings. In that order. Leviticus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The burnt, the meal, the peace, the sin, the trespass offerings. And then they are summed up again in chapters 6 and 7, and then I think in chapter 8 we get to purification of the priests, and so we move on beyond the laws of sacrifice. Okay, now what are you going to do? Have you ever thought of this? What if you live in Spain? Or let's make it not so drastic. What if you live in Asia Minor and you've sinned? You've sinned against the Lord. Or you want to have fellowship with the Lord. The Jews knew, to be Orthodox according to the Old Testament, there was one place where God put his name. He said, offer your sacrifices there and don't offer them anywhere else. And that's where? Jerusalem, the temple. Wow, all these sacrifices here that these men have to offer, that they want to offer. Well, you can't offer them very often. You see, that it all depends on how close you live to Jerusalem. And Palestine and Jerusalem could only hold so many people. It could not have held at that time the Jewish population of the world, so of the Roman Empire. So the only time you're really going to be able to offer your sacrifices are the sacrifices that surround those 3 feasts, if you go all 3 times, of Passover, of Pentecost, and of Tabernacles. You hope that you get your offerings done then. That will take care of your sins for the past year, and then next year you'll have to come again and take care of your sins then. Okay, the point is, what did you have to offer for your sacrifice? 500-pound cow. Now you got to bring that on a boat with you from Spain, plus a couple of oxen and some sheep, a goat or 2 here, maybe some dove. And you're going to bring a whole cargo of animals with you to sacrifice on the altar in Jerusalem. That's what the law said. Well, the rabbis, because of the diaspora, the rabbis came up with a new law, and they interpreted the Old Testament in reference to their current times, where you could turn your offerings into money. In other words, take your cow and go sell your cow. Get the money, okay? You with me thus far? And then, whenever you arrive in Jerusalem with that bag of money, and you see many Jewish people, whenever they're traveling to the annual feast back to Jerusalem, have lots of money that they're carrying with them. And then you have the subject of highwaymen, robbers, and we had many of them. Remember the man who was going down the road to Jericho, and he was waylaid by some highwaymen there. So we have multiple problems with that as well. But whenever you got to Palestine, then you turned your money back into animals, because you can't sacrifice money. You can pay your temple tax with money, not with an animal, but you've got to turn most of your money back into animals in order to offer the needed Levitical sacrifice for your sins. But there were several catches to all of this. And the ones who established the several catches were the religious leaders who profited financially from it. And this is something that has to be understood in order to understand so many negative references in Jesus' teaching to wealth and money. And we'll say more about that later. But you know how people do, whether you're in the faith message or out of the faith message, you really don't do any studies in the Bible. You just read the Bible, and you just come across passages, and you have a passage that seems to be saying that you shouldn't have any money. And you find several negative references about money. And then the faith ones find several positive references. And so you just fight at one another and argue. No one really knows why. Why do you have both of those then? Why do you have these negative references? Well, that's what I'm telling you. We have such a problem with the monetary setup of religion of that day, that people had come to equate prosperity with spirituality. and the most spiritual people, who just so happened to be the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, also were the wealthy ones among the Jews. And therefore all of the lay people looked up to the religious leaders because A, they were spiritually minded, it looked like, and B, they were financially well off, and being financially well off to them proved they must be spiritually well off. They never reversed it. They never thought because you're spiritually well off, that's why you're blessed. It's you are financially well off, and that must mean that you're spiritual then. So there were several catches. The priests said in the first place that only certain types of money would be acceptable at the temple. Now you can see where we're getting into the subject of money changers. Only certain types of money. Here were one of the catches. I'm going to give you two catches that were established by them. According to tractate number 15 in the Talmud. Remember, the Talmud's made up of various tractates. Tractate number 15, which is entitled Shekalim, just a plural for shekel. It's about money, Shekalim. Tractate number 15 in the Talmud entitled Shekalim. Shekalim, Shekalim. The first catch in the law of the rabbis and the priests was that you had to exchange your locally obtained money, that is, locally obtained in the place from which you came, for the accepted coins of Jerusalem. Now, most money in circulation in the Roman Empire of this day was either of Greek origin, and the basic coin was the drachma, or Roman origin, and the basic coin was the denarius. You should be familiar with those, at least in the names now. The drachma was the Greek coin, the denarius was the Roman coin. Both of these existed side by side in the 1st century A.D. However, by this time, the denarius had become the predominant of the two coins. The Greek coinage was slowly passing off the scene. The drachmas were still available, though. There were still many drachmas, but the denarius was a more important coin. Now, you see, since almost all the Jews arriving in Jerusalem, and Josephus tells us of the tens of thousands of people there at Passover time. And remember, that's why we have problems in the Gospels. The prefect Pontius Pilate is so concerned about a riot. Why there are just untold tens of thousands of people. And Josephus said, there was not enough room in the city to hold all the pilgrims whenever they came there at the annual feast. And the hills were just alive around the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is surrounded with hills, and the hills were alive with little tents that the people had brought with them to camp out in for the 7-day period or however long that you were going to be there. And so the hills, the area was just swarming with Jewish people, and there was money. Oh, there was money. It was like at a carnival. Everyone had brought all their money with them. And of course, if you want to make money, you got to find out how to tap into all of these people out there. They got untold shekels with them, drachmas, the denarius. They've got untold millions of dollars with them out there. And you got to find out, like sell tents. Paul made and sold tents, remember. It was a good trade to be in because everyone has to have a tent to live around there. You could sell tents or rent out a little piece of your property for them to camp on, like an RV or a KOA campground there or something. Just provide them with a swimming pool and putt-putt golf there, and they would camp out there. Or you could get in the money-changing business. And not everyone was going to play putt-putt, but everyone who came from outside of Palestine had to exchange their money. That was the business to be in. That is where all the religious people were. Remember, so many times Jesus caught them in inconsistencies in their knowledge of the Old Testament. Why too many of them spent too little time studying and too much time figuring out how to make more money off of God's people. Sometimes, remember in John, that same chapter we were in, John chapter 7. in verses, well, we don't need to get into it. We're going to run out of time. In verses 41 and 42, half the people don't know anything about messianic prophecies. Many times because religious leaders don't know. Now, the scribes generally knew because the scribes were copyists of the law, and so they spent all their time looking at the pages of the law. But a Pharisee or a Sadducee or one of the chief priests, that would be a different matter. And so because so many of the religious leaders didn't know the law, how could they teach the people the law? The people didn't know the law either. And so they didn't know whether this Christ should come out of Galilee or Bethlehem, and they didn't know of Jesus' origin because they weren't keeping up with what was going on. So anyway, to get back to what I was saying, since most of these Jews arriving in Jerusalem had come from other parts, either of Palestine, and that was possible, but most of them from other parts of the Roman Empire, they would only have Roman and Greek coins with them. And so it paved the way for a lucrative business for the priests. The sons of Annas, do you remember who Annas is in the New Testament? He was the high priest, and then his son-in-law Caiaphas becomes the high priest at the time of Jesus. But Annas continued to exercise great influence over the high priesthood for many years to come, both personally and through his descendants. The sons of Annas set up tables in the court of the Gentiles to change the money for the people from the drachmas and from the Roman denarius into Tyrian silver coins, which were the closest approximate to the now extinct Old Hebrew shekels. Now you'll know more than just Sunday school lessons about the money changers. The sons of Annas. They happen to be connected by birth, you see. These people happen to be able to make their money by birth, but it wasn't just by birth, it was by money occupation. So it's by birth and money occupation combined. They set up tables in the court of the Gentiles. There was a court of the Gentiles and the court of the women, then the court of Israel, and then the court of the priests. So this is the further court, the one that's out quite a distance from the temple itself. The court of the Gentiles. To change the denarius or the drachma into Tyrian. Tyrian, by that I mean Tyre, the city of Tyre, the Phoenician city of Tyre, into Tyrian silver coins. These were silver coins that were minted in the old Phoenician city of Tyre. And they were the closest approximate to what was extinct at this time, the Old Hebrew shekel. Now, that's what I mean by the catch. The priest said only certain types of coins could be used. And they just so happened to have a large store of these Tyrian silver coins available 3 times a year. You say, well, that doesn't make them any money. You just swap a coin for a coin. You swap it and charge 12% interest. 12% surcharge was allowed by the rabbinical law. They gave you their drachmas, let's say $1 worth of drachmas, and you gave them $1 worth of Tyrian silver coins. They had to pay 12% interest on. It was a purchase. It was an exchange, money changers, exchangers, but it was a purchase of a coin that was acceptable. Now, one of the reasons why some people have suggested that only the Tyrian silver coins were allowed was because of the profanations in writing and in picture on Roman and Greek coins. I gave you what was on the Roman coin last time. Whose image and inscription is this on the coin? That of Caesar. Well, how could that go into the treasury of God's house when it has a pagan Gentile leader on the coin? But that doesn't seem to be a valid excuse, because Even the Tyrian silver coins many times had pagan sayings on them. So that's kind of discounted by me anyway from the study that I've done, that it wasn't really an issue for the money changers. Now it was whenever they brought this denarius to Jesus, that was the issue there. But it really wasn't an issue with the money changers, whether or not it had profane symbol or writing on it. It's just you wanted to have a monopoly. And the only way to have a monopoly is mint your own coins, as it were, in Tyre, bring them down here to Jerusalem, and then exchange them for the denarius of the Romans or for the drachma of the Greeks. And then charge 12% interest on that. And then the other catch was, once you exchange your money, you exchange your pagan foreign money for local money, and then you have to equal up to a half shekel, and that goes right into the treasury to pay your temple tax. Now you've got to buy animals to offer your sacrifices. You can't buy animals with bad money. You have to buy animals with the right type of money. And it just so happened they kept a large store of oxen and cattle and doves around the temple. I wonder why. They knew there'd be untold multitudes of traveling Jews that would have need of them for their sacrificial purposes. So they're going to make money off you, first of all, just because you got to pay your temple tax, because they can charge you 12% surcharge on that. But then you're going to spend a lot more money because you have to buy all the animals that are necessary for your sacrifice. And you can't buy with bad money. You have to buy with rabbinical Jewish money. And they happen to have the animals, or they had a whole monopoly. And so when you have a monopoly, you charge whatever you want to charge then. And there can't be any complaints because there's nowhere else to go and get it. And besides that, it's so convenient. Let's say you found a herd of cattle up in Galilee. You don't want to come from Rome and buy your cattle up in Galilee and herd them down to Jerusalem. It's so easy when right beside the altar there's a nice, beautiful Bessie waiting for you. And so you just flip down $1, buy Bessie, and slit her throat, and you get it over with. Then you can go back home very soon instead of having to drag all of these animals with you. Only thing you had to drag was your money. And that's what the Jewish religious leaders wanted. We are just about out of time. I'm going to stop right there and pick up with this next time, cover it again. Then we'll look at the passages. We haven't gotten to the passages yet. But I think that you'll find all of this to be very interesting. You have a better view of some of the things in the New Testament then.